So today we're looking at United Methodist history. We're going to be looking at the beginnings of Methodism, focusing on John and Charles Wesley, the founders of Methodism, and kind of how everything started. So what we have on the screen now is a slide of Samuel Wesley and Susanna Wesley, John and Charles Wesley's parents. Samuel was the pastor, the priest at Epworth. That's where you get the name Epworth Forest. At the camp, and anything else that has an Epworth attached to it within Methodism is from that church. Samuel was also a graduate from Exeter College. Exeter College is one of the colleges at Oxford. Oxford is made up of 5 colleges. Susanna was in charge of teaching all the children at home, and also one thing that's very interesting about Susanna and very different from most parents is that she also taught the girls to read and to read very well. Typically in this time frame, girls weren't well read. They couldn't read well because they were not allowed to go to secondary school. They couldn't enroll at university, and so they really typically weren't able to read well. Susanna felt like that was a kind of a black eye on women, an insult to women and their intelligence, and so she had a rule that before the girls were able to learn a skill like sewing or baking or something of that nature, they had to be able to read well. Susanna and Samuel's parents were both Anglican priests. So we had Catholicism throughout the world for a very long time. During the Reformation period, we have King Henry VIII, Henry Tudor. He's famous for having all the wives and for getting a divorce. He wanted to get a divorce, and the church or the Catholic Church wouldn't allow it, so that he just kind of split off from the Catholic Church and started the Church of England, which is now what we know as the Episcopal Church. At that time, it was considered Anglicanism, and he led England into a national church in the Church of England. And then his daughter, after his son ruled for just a little while, he was very sick and died. His daughter Mary ruled. She's known as Bloody Mary. She killed a ton of Protestant Reformation people. She brought Catholicism back to England and kind of ruled very nastily and very harshly for years. She died of what was a stomach tumor, most people believe. And then her sister Queen Elizabeth took over and brought Protestantism and the Anglican Church back. And however, one of the things that she did was said that everyone had to conform to the standards of Anglicanism and Protestantism, and even the priests had to do it without reading any of the documents. And so many of those priests refused to do that, and they lost their churches, they lost their parishes during that time. They were called nonconformists. Susanna Wesley and Samuel Wesley's fathers were both priests who lost their churches during that time and were labeled as nonconformists. However, Susanna and Samuel were both very loyal to the Church of England, very loyal to the Anglican Church, and raised their family to be very loyal to that church as well. This is the rectory at Epworth, or the parsonage. At that point in time, rectories were connected to the church. You see a lot of Catholic churches that are still this way. You'll see the church and then a kind of a breezeway, and then the rectory or the parsonage or the rector. And so this is the parsonage rectory at Epworth. It's destroyed by fire in this picture in 1709. This is the second time that this rectory burnt, and both times it's believed that it was arson from a parishioner or from a person that went to the church. John was stuck on the second floor of the house, and you can see in the picture they kind of made a human ladder to go up and be able to get him out. After he was saved, Susanna said that God had a special purpose for him, that he was a brand plucked from the fire. And so she poured a ton of energy into his theological education and preparing him for whatever God had in store for him in his upcoming life. In June of 1720, John goes up to Oxford. You notice that it says up. No one ever goes down to Oxford. They always go up to Oxford. That's a big deal in England. You see part of the church of the college he went to. It's called Christ Church. It's actually Christ Church College, but again, you never say Christ Church College. You always say Christ Church for whatever reason. He went with the intention to prepare for ordination. Susanna wanted him to be an ordained priest. His father did not want him to do that. He wanted him to study law or something of that nature. However, Susanna wanted him to do so, to become an ordained priest. So John goes and works on getting a bachelor's in divinity while he is at Oxford. During this time, it's where he really starts to begin to develop his own understanding of God and theology. So the next couple slides are kind of fun, and we'll talk about the difference between ordination in Wesley's day and ordination in the United Methodist Church today. So ordination in Wesley's day consisted of a bachelor's degree. It was a bachelor's degree in divinity, typically. There was a written test for priest orders, and this test was not like, okay, write what you think about this or write what you think about this. This is very specific questions, and there were very specific answers to them. So there may have been a theology section where you had the chance to say what you thought about something or believed about something, but the other answers were very specific and what they were looking for, like any other test. 2 years of probation. During that 2 years, the person must obtain a Master's of Arts, and that Master's of Arts is in divinity as well. And then they have another written test for ordination as a priest. Now that first written test for ordination is as a deacon. So you're ordained as a deacon first, and then you're ordained as a priest. It's a 2-year process to get to that ordination as a priest. That used to really mirror the United Methodist or the Methodist way that we ordained, and it mirrored that up until I believe the 1992 Book of Discipline. We used to ordain people as deacons first, and then we would ordain them as elders. We call them elders or as pastors. And also the Episcopal Church. So the Episcopal Church is what the Church of England used to be. The Anglican Church in the United States, it's now known as the Episcopal Church. It very much mirrors this process still today, other than you must obtain a Master's of Divinity before you're ordained as a deacon, and then you have 2 years probationary status before you're ordained as a priest. I have a good friend. He and I went to seminary together. He's from Rwanda. His name is Emmanuel, and he was just back in June. He was ordained as a deacon in the Episcopal Church, and so then in 2 years he'll be ordained as a priest as long as he passes his written examination. So ordination in the Methodist Church has really evolved from that over the years. So this is what ordination today looks like. You have to have 1 year membership as United Methodist, and then there's actually a point that's missing. I need to update that. And you have to then send a letter to the district superintendent explaining your feel that you have been called into vocational ministry, been called to be a pastor, and that is going to be your job. You have a recommendation from your staff parish relations committee or your pastor parish relations committee. That's the committee that helps the church to kind of bridge the gap between the pastor and the other employees of the church and then the congregation. So it's kind of like a human resources committee somewhat, and not really, but kind of. Then you have to be approved by your charge conference. A charge conference is a voting body of the church that's made up of members who hold certain positions within the congregation, and they have to approve you then to go into ministry. After that, you have a psychological evaluation and a background check and a credit check. You have to write about 15 pages on Wesley's introductory questions into ministry. Questions like, what does it mean to have a life that is holy living, and things of that nature. You go to something called License to Preach School, which is 80 intensive hours. License to Preach School is different now from when I took it. I went to License to Preach in 2006. So 11 years ago is when I went. Today you do 1 8-hour day, and then you do several hours online, and then you go back for another 8-hour day. When I did it, I went to Michigan to take my license to preach. Excuse me, I'm yawning here, I apologize. Went to Michigan to take my license to preach. I did 5 days intensive where we did 10 hours a day in a classroom setting. And then I did 4 weekends at different churches in Michigan to do the rest of the education. So then once that's done, you're approved by the District Committee of Ordained Ministry, or DCOM. Each district has their own District Committee of Ordained Ministry. It's made up of 2/3 clergy, or pastors or deacons, and 1/3 lay people, so people who are members and attend churches. I am on the District Committee of Ordained Ministry for the Northwest District, and they have to give you an approval. You have to have your bachelor's degree done. It really doesn't matter what your bachelor's degree in. It can be in underwater basket weaving. It really doesn't matter. You have to then obtain a master's of divinity from an approved seminary, minimum of 78 credit hours. Most masters of divinity programs are at least 85 to 93. It is the longest master's degree that you can get. There are no other master's degrees that are longer than a master's of divinity. You have to write, says 250 pages. It's about 250 pages total throughout the process. So that first time around, you have to write about 45 to 50 pages. A lot of questions, a lot of theological questions. How do you understand evil in the world? What are the role of the sacraments in the life of a person? Things of that nature. You spend a lot of time writing those, writing some other questions, and then also there's 16 of those questions. There's 3 supplemental questions, and then you write an 8 to 10 page autobiography. That stuff is all submitted by November 1st. Then sometime in February, you interview with the Board of Ordained Ministry. There's about 60 people that sits on the Board of Ordained Ministry, and they are, again, 2/3 clergy, which are either pastors or deacons, and then 1/3 lay people who are members of congregations. You're interviewed by that board and 4 people, and then the entire board votes on you. And if you are approved, then you are commissioned as a provisional elder. So this is back when we used to ordain as deacons. This has replaced that, to be commissioned as a provisional elder, or to be commissioned as a provisional deacon, because we have a different order of deacons now. You have a 3-year RIM process, which is residence in ministry. You have to go to 9 overnight retreats. 3 of those overnight retreats are 3 days long, and the other 6 are 2 days long. You have to write about another 50 pages, not 200, another 50 to 60 pages. And then you submit that again, and then you're interviewed again by the Board of Ordained Ministry and approved by them and all clergy at annual conference. One thing that again isn't in here that I left out, you also have to complete something called Clinical Pastoral Education, or CPE, which is at least 400 hours, and you spend 300 hours as a chaplain and 100 hours in a group setting. And then you're ordained. And within our context of the United Methodist Church, ordination is for life unless you have a chargeable offense that would cause them to remove your credentials. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. These are the different orders or types of pastors in the United Methodist Church. And actually, I did these sets of slides 2 years ago, and it's changed since then. There's another order that has come out of the 2016 Book of Discipline, and that is called the certified lay minister. So a lay minister is someone who is a member of the church who has received some training through lay servant ministry classes and has become able to fill a pulpit for up to 6 weeks. So able to preach for up to 6 weeks. A pastor may be gone on leave, they may be gone on vacation, and so there's a couple weeks there, may be sick, there may be a move and they haven't appointed, a new pastor yet, something of that nature, and so they fill in for up to 6 weeks. Certified lay ministers can fill in indefinitely. They have continued education that they have to do, several classes that they have to take in order to be certified. However, those people are not pastors. They are ministers. And the difference is there is no sacramental rites as a minister, so they can't preside and bless communion. Now they can serve communion, they can give it to people. However, it has to be blessed by a ordained elder or a commissioned elder. And they also cannot baptize people, and they cannot receive people into membership. Then we have the Order of Ordained Deacons. The Order of Ordained Deacons, they are called to service and to word. So they do preach some, but more often they're looking at social justice issues. They work as associate pastors. They typically aren't senior pastors. They work as associate pastors. They work as directors of Christian education. Sometimes you'll have an ordained deacon who is a youth director or a youth pastor and those type of things. And then ordained elders, who are pastors senior pastors of churches, associate pastors. They're called word, order, and sacrament, and so they preside over communion and baptism. They preach, they order the life of the church, and serve on conference committees and those type of things. One thing I guess I should have said on that last slide is I'm in the process of being ordained as an elder. I'm a commissioned provisional elder now, and then in 2019 will be ordained as an elder. So in 1725, John Wesley read Jeremy Taylor's Rule and Exercise of Holy Living and Holy Dying. This is a really interesting book, and it's really all about how you use your time to live holy. It got Wesley really concerned about not wasting time, not spending time in idle conversation, things of that nature. He began to keep track of his progress and used a diary, and was very, very faithful in logging down most everything he did and the use of his time. Most of the things we know about John Wesley are because of his diary. And for Wesley, life became totally and completely about holiness at this point in time. In 1725, he began to write about the assurance of salvation. So what that means is that the understanding that you are saved. Yes, I am saved. Yes, I am going to heaven, and this is why I know that. For Wesley, this had been a struggle up to this point, and he really begins to write about it. In 1726, he becomes an education fellow at Lincoln College. So an education fellow is basically like a tutor to the students, and it helps them prepare for the rigors of college. Secondary schools didn't do a real good job of preparing people for those rigors, and so there were education fellows who helped to do that, and Wesley became an education fellow. Pretty normal for someone who's pursuing ordination to do that, and then possibly going on to get their doctorate of divinity, which Wesley didn't do. June of 1726, John Wesley's brother Charles comes to Christ College to study. At this point in time, he has no intention of being a pastor. He is studying divinity, but Charles wants to be a politician and plans on that's what he's going to do. On February 14th of 1727, John accepts a position as the curate at Epworth. He becomes his father's associate pastor at Epworth. Samuel was very, very intelligent and very well educated, and also Samuel had written quite a few things, but he was working on kind of his life's work, which was a huge, huge dissertation and theological discourse of the book of Job. And so John helps him with doing that. And John wrote a letter back to Charles and said that this associate pastor's role had really kind of fit a hole in his life, and he felt like that if he had not, that he was possibly settled for life there at Epworth, or at least for several years to come. So on September 22nd of 1728, John Wesley is ordained as a priest. That same year, Charles begins to have a spiritual awakening. So for Charles, the study of divinity begins to bring him closer to God, and he begins to have this awakening and begins to realize that his calling is more than that of a calling of just being a politician, but really being called to serve God through his vocation or his life. John arrives back at Oxford in the summer of 1729. He arrives back at Oxford because Charles asked him to come back. At Oxford at this point in time, they're really combating the influence of deism within the confines of Oxford and England itself. Deism is, famous deists are people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Deism is the belief that God created everything, including Jesus, and that Jesus isn't necessarily the way to salvation, but salvation can be earned through good works. And because we're all created by God, then we are all able to kind of be our own gods somewhat. And so deism is kind of dangerous, and it's starting to spread through Oxford, and so they are wanting fellows to come back and teach and to be the tutors for these students, and Charles specifically asked for John to come and be his fellow, and he goes back to Oxford in 1729. This begins the Holy Club at Oxford. John and Charles Wesley, William Morgan, and Bob Kirkman, they meet together on a regular basis and really try to live a holy life. And they're trying to search out for what it means to be holy and to have an understanding of who they are and what they are and how to interact with the Bible and the writings of classical Christian teachers and those type of things. So this is what an average week looked like for the Holy Club. Tuesday they'd meet in Charles's room. Thursday they would meet in Kirkman's room. Saturday they would meet in John's room. Sunday they would meet in Morgan's room. Weekdays they read the classics and they prayed. And so reading the classics were like Homer's Iliad and things of that nature, classical writings, not necessarily theological or divinity writings. On Sundays they would read divinity and attend worship and receive the sacraments. They would attend just about every worship service that there was at Oxford, and they would receive sacraments at those. And again, that made people think, they're kind of weird. There's something different about them. They're constantly at worship, and there are these Bible moths or Bible thumpers. They're started to call Methodists, which was a derogatory term, and so they are just kind of different from everyone else who is around that area. So out of this, a very significant foundation for Methodism begins, and it's really our work in social justice and our outreach work. And William Morgan is really responsible for that. William Morgan influenced John Wesley and Charles Wesley to begin to start reaching out to people. In August of 1730, Morgan convinces John to visit Castle Prison. Castle Prison is where they kept people who couldn't pay their debts, as well as adulterers. And this so touched John's life and changed his life that they decided they were going to start visiting weekly and visiting all of the inmates there at the prison on a weekly basis. So August 21st was their first visit. However, they started setting up days of the week for each person to go and visit, and John went and visited on Saturdays. The Holy Club began spending several hours a week working with the poor and the sick. In December of 1730, they started visiting the city jail as well as visiting Castle Prison. In 1731, Morgan falls ill, and we'll kind of talk about that next week, a lot more about his illness and how that affects things. But one thing that Morgan had been doing was he had kind of brought together all of these orphans, and he was using his money, his stipend that he received from his family, and providing pretty much solely for all these orphans. So Morgan is Irish, and he goes back home to Ireland, and because he's ill. And when he goes back home, Wesley and his friends try to take care of these orphans on their own, and they find out that it's just too much, not financially necessary, but just too much work. And so they pull together their resources and they hire Mrs. Platt to fill Morgan's spot and to care for the children. And so this becomes the foundation of the first Methodist orphanage, and that is established in England. So that's our look at the first week. So next week what will happen is we will get into The second part of Methodism, the second great rise of Methodism, will look at the foundations of the first churches that are established, and the bands and the social classes and things of that nature. The following week we'll look at theology, and then the last week we'll look at the Methodist experience in the United States. So have a blessed day.